All right, we're going to discuss renal autoregulation. Now, the first renal autoregulation, we talk about renal autoregulation. This is basically the kidneys regulating your GFR. So the first type that I discussed, the first video that you should watch was talking about different types. So we're doing renal autoregulation as myogenic contraction. So first type is myogenic contraction. So when we say myogenic contraction, basically your kidneys are regulating the blood pressure that you have. So a lot of people who have problems with blood pressure, it's really bad on their kidneys. Their kidneys have to basically, constantly regulate what's going on. So I'm going to just talk about myogenic contraction. So basically your afferent arteriole is going to be responsible for detecting your blood pressure changes. It monitors your blood pressure. So these are going to be like stretch receptors. So whenever you have increased blood pressure, this is going to stretch the afferent arterioles out. And your body says, oh, you have really high blood pressure. So if you have really high blood pressure, you're going to have a lot of GFR. But your body doesn't want you to urinate all that out. So when we overstretch it, it's like a negative feedback. We need to vasoconstrict the afferent arteriole because it's stretching it out too much. So during a myogenic contraction, you have high blood pressure, which stretches the arteriole. In order to lower the GFR, your afferent arteriole is going to vasoconstrict. It vasoconstricts, which means it is going to narrow the lumen. To decrease your GFR. Because anytime you vasoconstrict the faucet, you basically have a decrease in GFR. So the first thing was myogenic contraction. We always said myogenic contraction is going to be monitoring your blood pressure. So your afferent arteriole, if it stretches out, then we would have increased GFR, but it doesn't like too much. So what it'll do is it'll vasoconstrict so that we can lower our GFR. So the next one is called the tubular glomerular feedback. All right, so this one I have to discuss a little bit differently because we've talked about the renal tubules, and I drew the renal tubule out like this, but it actually looks a little bit different. So I am going to draw basically the glomerulus and describe some cells that are involved. So I'm going to draw this a little differently. It doesn't matter how you draw it as long as you understand approach is your afferent arteriole and exit is your efferent arteriole. So this is now going to be our approach, our afferent arteriole, and our exit our efferent arteriole. So technically, when we talk about the renal tubule, your filtrate is going to basically go to the proximal convoluted tubule, and then you're going to have your descending limb, and then you're going to have your loop of Henle. I'm going to kind of stretch this out. And then you're going to have your distal convoluted tubule, which sits right next to your efferent arteriole. So what we're looking at is tubular glomerular feedback. And this is specifically going to happen at the distal convoluted tubule. Okay, you have a couple of cells right here, right by your efferent arteriole, called your macula densa. So I'm going to draw cells right here. This is not like anatomically correct. Your macula densa are a group of cells that detect levels of sodium chloride inside of your distal convoluted tubule. It basically is detecting the levels of sodium chloride, in your blood, right here. It detects the levels of sodium chloride in the blood and in the filtrate. So the filtrate, remember, is the urine that's produced and goes into the proximal convoluted tubule. So we need to measure the amount of sodium chloride that we have inside of the distal convoluted tubule and in the blood. Now, if you have in your blood high levels of sodium chloride, then that means that you're probably dehydrated. So we need to change our GFR. So when we basically detect that we have high levels, the macula densa is going to be what detects when we have high levels of sodium chloride in the filtrate. We need to basically start saving some water. So that means that we're super dehydrated if we have high levels of sodium chloride. So we need to decrease our GFR because GFR is going to produce urine. If you have high levels of sodium chloride, man, your urine is concentrated. So your filtrate is going to have sodium chloride in it. So sodium chloride is going to be urinated out. So we're detecting the sodium chloride levels in the distal convoluted tubule. So when you have high levels of sodium chloride in the filtrate, that means you're super dehydrated. So we need to stop producing urine. We need to slow it down. So we need to control your afferent and efferent arteriole, because ultimately that's what always controls your GFR level. So this one is very different than your afferent arteriole, which is going to vasoconstrict. This one, it is going to vasodilate your efferent arteriole, so more drains, because we need to decrease our GFR. We need to decrease the GFR. That's the goal. So if we need to decrease the GFR, the first thing that we need to do is we need to vasoconstrict the afferent arteriole. That G decreases the GFR when you do vasoconstriction. And then your efferent arteriole, to decrease our GFR, is going to vasodilate. When you vasodilate the efferent arteriole, you decrease your GFR. So, tubular glomerular feedback levels is detecting the amounts of sodium chloride. When you have high levels of sodium chloride, that means you're super dehydrated and you need to drink water to concentrate basically your blood so that you can pee. But when you have high levels of sodium chloride, that means you have low levels of water, so you need to decrease your GFR. Now, this is renal autoregulation. I'm going to also do neural regulation of the kidneys. When you say neural regulation, you're talking about the nervous system. All right, so you're saying your nervous system. Now, during fight or flight, you have to remember that you're stressed out. So maybe you're stressed because, something impelled your abdomen. So we need to minimize fluid loss. Remember, fight or flight, your never urination, that's parasympathetic, SLUD, salivation, lacrimation, urination, defecation, digestion. In fight or flight, you're running from a tiger. We need to minimize fluid loss. You're trying to run from a bear. So if we're trying to minimize fluid loss and we're talking about neural regulation of the kidneys, then we ultimately want to decrease the GFR. But something very different happens with the sympathetic nervous system. This actually causes you to vasoconstrict both the afferent and the efferent. Basically, you're cutting off all blood to the kidneys. So, we vasoconstrict both the afferent arteriole and the efferent arteriole. And the reason we are doing that is we don't want blood to go to the kidneys. We are in fight or flight mode, so we are contracting our muscles for our life. So we vasoconstrict, we cut off the kidneys because they're non-essential. And the reason is we need to minimize fluid loss.